In exchange for $25 billion, the IMF wanted only one thing: for him to surrender his country's sovereignty. But Ibrahim Traoré's response was so powerful that all of Africa followed his example. The mahogany conference table in the International Monetary Fund's headquarters in Washington, D.C. gleamed under the fluorescent lights as Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva shuffled through her papers one final time. Across from her sat Ibrahim Traoré, the young president of Burkina Faso, flanked by his small delegation of economic advisors. The contrast couldn't have been starker. The IMF's team of 30-plus economists, lawyers, and policy specialists versus Burkina Faso's modest four-person delegation. It was October 2023, and Burkina Faso was facing what international media described as an economic crisis. Years of political instability, combined with the global impacts of the Ukraine war and climate change, had strained the country's finances. International credit agencies had downgraded Burkina Faso's rating, making borrowing expensive and difficult. To most observers, this meeting seemed like a foregone conclusion. A poor African nation facing economic difficulties would naturally accept whatever assistance the IMF offered. The pattern had repeated dozens of times across the continent over the past 60 years. President Traoré. Georgieva began with the practiced smile of someone who had conducted hundreds of similar meetings. We're here to discuss how the International Monetary Fund can assist Burkina Faso during these challenging times. We've prepared a comprehensive support package worth $25 billion over 5 years. The number hung in the air like a promise of salvation. $25 billion represented nearly twice Burkina Faso's annual GDP. It was more money than the country had ever seen, enough to transform every aspect of its economy and infrastructure. Traoré listened carefully as Georgieva outlined the package. It included immediate budget support, infrastructure development funds, agricultural modernization programs, and technical assistance. On paper, it appeared to be exactly what Burkina Faso needed. This represents one of the largest support packages we've ever offered to a country of Burkina Faso's size, Georgieva continued. It demonstrates our commitment to African development and our confidence in your administration's ability to implement necessary reforms. The word reforms was where the conversation began to shift into more complex territory. Dr. James Morrison, the IMF's Director of African Affairs, opened a thick folder and began outlining the conditions attached to the $25 billion. The package comes with a comprehensive structural adjustment program, Morrison explained. These are proven policies that have successfully restored economic stability in numerous countries. As Morrison detailed the conditions, Traoré's expression remained neutral, but his advisors began exchanging glances. The reforms were extensive and invasive, touching every aspect of Burkina Faso's governance and economy. The IMF required Burkina Faso to privatize all state-owned enterprises, including the national mining company, telecommunications provider, and energy utility. Government spending would be reduced by 40%, requiring massive cuts to education, healthcare, and social programs. Agricultural subsidies that helped small farmers compete with multinational corporations would be eliminated. Most significantly, the package required Burkina Faso to abandon its plans for monetary sovereignty and commit to using the CFA franc, a currency controlled by France, for at least 25 years. All major economic policies would require IMF approval before implementation. These conditions ensure fiscal responsibility and create an attractive environment for international investment, Morrison explained. Similar programs have been successful in Ghana, Kenya, and other African nations. Traoré finally spoke. Dr. Morrison, when you say successful, what metrics are you using? Morrison seemed surprised by the question. Most African leaders in similar meetings focused on securing the funding rather than questioning the IMF's track record. Well, macroeconomic stability, currency stabilization, improved credit ratings. What about poverty reduction? Traoré interrupted. What about local employment? What about food security? Morrison shifted uncomfortably. Those are longer-term outcomes that typically improve once macroeconomic fundamentals are stabilized. Traoré pulled out a folder from his briefcase. Dr. Morrison, I've reviewed the outcomes of similar IMF programs across Africa over the past 20 years. In countries that accepted these structural adjustment packages, poverty increased by an average of 23% during the first 5 years. Local employment in manufacturing sectors declined by 35%. Foreign ownership of strategic resources increased to over 80%. The room fell silent. African leaders weren't supposed to come to IMF meetings with their own economic analysis questioning the fund's approaches. President Traoré. Georgieva interjected. I think there may be some misunderstanding about how these programs work. The short-term adjustments are necessary to create sustainable long-term growth. Ms. Georgieva, with respect, I understand exactly how these programs work. They transfer ownership of African resources to multinational corporations while creating dependency on international financial institutions. The $25 billion you're offering today would be paid back with interest exceeding $40 billion over the next 30 years. Traoré opened his folder and placed a document on the table. But more importantly, the conditions you're proposing would essentially transfer economic decision-making authority from the elected government of Burkina Faso to bureaucrats in Washington and Paris. That's not development assistance, that's economic colonization. The accusation hung heavy in the air. Georgieva's diplomatic smile faltered slightly. President Traoré, I think you're mischaracterizing our relationship. The IMF exists to help countries achieve sustainable development. Then why, Traoré asked, do IMF programs consistently result in increased foreign ownership of African resources? Why do they require the dismantling of exactly those government programs that protect local industries and agriculture? He placed another document on the table. This is an analysis of lithium mining contracts in countries that have accepted similar IMF packages. In every case, the international investment you promote results in African countries receiving less than 8% of the value of their own resources. Morrison leaned forward. President Traoré, these are complex economic issues. Perhaps your advisors could benefit from our technical assistance programs to better understand global financial markets. The condescension in Morrison's tone was unmistakable. Traoré's chief economist, Dr. Fatima Ouedraogo, who had earned her Ph.D. from the London School of Economics and worked for 10 years at the World Bank before returning to serve her country, bristled visibly. Dr. Morrison, Traoré replied calmly, my team understands global financial markets quite well, which is why we're rejecting your offer. The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Georgieva sat back in her chair, genuinely shocked. In her 15 years with the IMF, she had never had an African leader reject a major assistance package outright. I'm sorry, did you say reject? Morrison asked, as if he hadn't heard correctly. That's correct. Burkina Faso will not accept the IMF's $25 billion package. Georgieva recovered her composure quickly. President Traoré, I think you should carefully consider the implications of this decision. Without IMF support, Burkina Faso will find it very difficult to access international capital markets. Other development partners may be reluctant to provide assistance without our endorsement. The threat was politely phrased but unmistakable. Reject the IMF, and Burkina Faso would face international financial isolation. Ms. Georgieva, I appreciate your concern for Burkina Faso's welfare, but we've found alternative arrangements that don't require surrendering our sovereignty. Traoré opened his briefcase again and placed a much thicker folder on the table. Over the past 8 months, we've been developing what we call the African Monetary Independence Initiative. 12 African countries have committed to creating an alternative to the Western-dominated financial system. He slid the folder toward Georgieva. The details are all there. Combined, our member countries have foreign reserves exceeding $200 billion, populations of over 400 million people, and control over 60% of the world's strategic minerals. Georgieva opened the folder with barely concealed skepticism, but as she began reading, her expression changed. The document outlined a comprehensive plan for African financial independence that was sophisticated, well-researched, and potentially viable. The African Development Bank will provide initial funding, Traoré continued. China and Russia have committed to technology transfer and infrastructure development on terms that respect our sovereignty. Most importantly, We're creating an African common currency backed by our mineral resources rather than foreign debt. Morrison was reading over Georgieva's shoulder, his face growing pale. This would fundamentally challenge the existing international financial architecture. Exactly, Traoré replied. The current system was designed to extract wealth from Africa while maintaining our dependence on Western institutions. We're creating an alternative that puts African development under African control. The implications of what Traoré was describing began to sink in around the table. If successful, the African Monetary Independence Initiative would represent the largest challenge to Western financial hegemony since the establishment of the Bretton Woods system. The 12 founding members represent 40% of Africa's GDP, Traoré explained. But we expect rapid expansion once other countries see the benefits of genuine independence over conditional assistance. Georgieva closed the folder, her diplomatic training struggling to mask her alarm. President Traoré, this is a very ambitious plan, but implementing such a system would be extremely complex. There are regulatory frameworks, international law considerations, existing treaty obligations, all of which we've addressed with the help of international legal experts and economists who believe in African self-determination rather than perpetual dependency. The meeting continued for another hour, with IMF officials alternating between skepticism and barely concealed hostility. They questioned the technical feasibility of the African initiative, warned about potential retaliation from international markets, and suggested that Traoré was being unrealistic about Africa's capabilities. But Traoré had answers for every concern. His team had spent months preparing for exactly these arguments, working with African economists, legal experts, and policy specialists who understood both the existing system's flaws and the requirements for creating viable alternatives. As the meeting concluded, Georgieva made one final attempt. President Traoré, our offer remains open. If your alternative arrangements don't work out, the IMF stands ready to assist Burkina Faso. Traoré stood and shook hands with the IMF delegation. Ms. Georgieva, I appreciate the offer, but we won't be coming back. Africa's future lies in African solutions, not Western conditional assistance. As Traoré's delegation left the IMF building, word of the rejection began spreading through Washington's policy circles. Within hours, international media were reporting the story with headlines like, Burkina Faso rejects $25 billion IMF package, and African leader chooses independence over international aid. But the real impact began to unfold over the following weeks. Traoré's rejection of the IMF wasn't just a symbolic gesture, it was the launching point for a coordinated African challenge to Western financial dominance. Within a month, 3 more African countries had withdrawn from IMF programs and joined the African Monetary Independence Initiative. The president of Ghana announced a comprehensive review of his country's relationship with international financial institutions. Nigeria's finance minister gave a speech calling for African solutions to African challenges. The African Development Bank, strengthened by contributions from member countries of the Independence Initiative, began offering development financing on terms that competed directly with IMF packages. Unlike IMF loans, these came without structural adjustment requirements or sovereignty-compromising conditions. 6 months after Traoré's rejection of the IMF package, the African Monetary Independence Initiative held its first continental summit in Accra, Ghana. Representatives from 27 African countries attended, with 15 nations formally joining the initiative. The summit's final declaration was a direct challenge to the existing global financial order. Africa possesses the resources, expertise, and determination to finance its own development without surrendering sovereignty to external institutions. The era of conditional assistance and structural adjustment is ending. The Western financial establishment's response was swift and alarmed. The World Bank issued warnings about the risks of financial experimentation. The European Union expressed concern about monetary instability. The United States Treasury Department began discussing potential sanctions against countries that abandoned Western financial institutions. But the momentum was unstoppable. African countries that had spent decades under IMF structural adjustment programs began comparing their experiences with the rapid development occurring in initiative member states. Burkina Faso itself became a showcase for the alternative approach. Using African Development Bank financing and technology partnerships with China and Russia, the country began developing its lithium resources under terms that kept 70% of revenues within Burkina Faso. Educational and healthcare spending increased rather than decreased. Agricultural programs supported small farmers rather than multinational agribusiness. A year after rejecting the IMF's $25 billion, Traoré addressed the United Nations General Assembly about the African Monetary Independence Initiative. Some have criticized Africa for rejecting conditional assistance, he told the assembled world leaders. But we've learned that true development cannot be imported. It must be homegrown. Africa's resources belong to African people, and Africa's future should be decided by African leaders. The speech received a standing ovation from African delegations and notable support from countries across the global south who had their own experiences with conditional international assistance. By 2025, the African Monetary Independence Initiative included 38 of Africa's 54 countries. The African common currency, backed by the continent's vast mineral wealth, had become a major force in international trade. African countries were financing their own development through African institutions using African resources. The transformation wasn't without challenges. Western financial institutions and multinational corporations that had profited from African dependency fought back through trade restrictions, diplomatic pressure, and media campaigns questioning African financial competence. But the results spoke for themselves. GDP growth across initiative member countries averaged 8% annually. Poverty rates declined for the first time in decades. Educational enrollment increased. Healthcare systems expanded. Most importantly, Africans began to see themselves as partners in global development rather than recipients of Western charity. The IMF, meanwhile, found itself increasingly marginalized in African affairs. Country after country chose African alternatives over Western conditional assistance. The fund's African portfolio shrank by 60% in 3 years, forcing a fundamental reassessment of its approaches. At a 2026 conference on international development, Kristalina Georgieva reflected on the transformation that had begun with Traoré's rejection of the $25 billion package. We underestimated both African capabilities and African determination to control their own destiny, she admitted. The IMF must evolve to remain relevant in a world where developing countries have viable alternatives to our traditional approaches. For Traoré, the decision to reject $25 billion had proven to be the most important economic choice of his presidency. What had appeared to be a reckless rejection of desperately needed assistance had instead catalyzed the largest transformation in African economics since independence. When asked about that pivotal moment in the IMF headquarters, Traoré would reflect. $25 billion seemed like a fortune, but it came with a price we couldn't afford: our freedom to determine our own future. Africa's resources are worth far more than any conditional loan, and Africa's dignity is priceless. The rejection that shocked the world in 2023 had become the foundation for African economic independence by 2026. It proved that sometimes the most important word a leader can say is no, especially when saying yes means surrendering the sovereignty that makes all other choices possible. The mahogany table in the IMF headquarters still hosted meetings with world leaders, but fewer and fewer of them came from Africa. Those who did often came not as supplicants seeking assistance, but as equals proposing partnerships. The balance of power in international finance had shifted, and it had started with one African leader's refusal to trade his country's future for conditional aid. In the end, Ibrahim Traoré's no had been heard around the world, inspiring a generation of leaders to choose difficult independence over comfortable dependency. Africa's economic liberation had begun not with acceptance of external assistance, but with the courage to reject it in favor of African solutions to African challenges.